Hi, everyone. Let's get started with our conversation about chapter 14. And before we get started with that, in this chapter, we learn about Ron's life after he is released from prison. And so, for this chapter on Cobra, I have three videos for you to watch. The first two deal with what happens when prisoners are released from prison. In our country, we have a lot of different prisons, state prisons, federal prisons, and they all release prisoners in a little different way. Some of them, you serve your time, and then the next day they just release you. Goodbye. Nothing. And for those people, especially, it can be very scary. It's like, wait a minute, I've done this for years of my life. What do I do now? You don't have money, you don't have a job, and some people don't have family to help support them, so it's really hard. Some of them still have to pay certain things, and when you don't have money, how do you do that? How do you still have to pay paroles and things like that? Um, the other video that I've got on there is about a man named Ed Ates, and his case was featured in one of my true crime podcasts that I listen to called Truth and Justice with Bob Ruff. I think it's season 3. It's a really great case. Um, but this video is about him and his wife and the struggles that he has had to go through. He was wrongfully convicted of a murder, and he spent 20 years in prison. Um, because of the podcast and because of the Innocence Project in Texas, where he was convicted at, they were able to help get him released. Now, he was released on parole, and typically, when you're released on parole, you have to admit your guilt in that crime you were convicted of. Otherwise, they will never parole you. Ed has never done that. His case is very unique. People have not seen this before, where a man who has always professed his innocence was paroled. um, and so, because of the podcast, because of the Innocence Project, thousands of readers actually wrote into the parole board and said this man is innocent. Um, the jailhouse snitch recanted, um, and things are looking a lot different for his case. And actually, several members of the parole board went and talked to Ed, and they released him, and that's amazing. He got a lot of support. So he had been married and had 2 kids when he went into prison. By the time that Bob and the podcast started talking to him about the case, he hadn't talked to his wife for a number of years. He wasn't even sure if he was married anymore. And because of Bob and the podcast, he and his wife got to reconnect. And so when Ed came out, he had a wife who had a good job. They have a house. He was set up with his own job. He's a UPS driver. But he needed a vehicle to go to work, and he's a tall guy. He needs something that he can fit in. And so one of the podcast listeners knew a friend who worked at a dealership, and she went and talked to her friend, and the friend's like, I listened to the podcast. I know that case, and they donated a truck to him, and so that's great. Um, but he still has not been exonerated. He was paroled, so he still has that conviction, but they're working on getting him exonerated, and when he can get exonerated, he can get compensation money. And the problem is they do have stuff to exonerate him, but they want to do it in such a way that they exonerate him at the same time as arresting the real person. So they're trying to do all of that together because that's important. We can't forget the person who was murdered in this case, the real victim. Even though Ed was a victim as well in this. So those are things to take a look at and think about with this chapter and what Ron's going through is how, unfortunately, in our society, when we see a monstrous crime happen, we think it has to be a monster who did this, and they were someone horrible who did this. And so when we arrest someone, a lot of times we assume that they're guilty even before the trial, but once they're convicted, we think we're going to throw them away and throw away the key, and we don't care what happens to them. And we need to change that in our society, and we need to take care of those in prison. We need a prison system where an inmate gets paroled and doesn't have PTSD because they were in prison. And people are having that. In a prison system, you have people who are guilty. They know they're guilty. They admit it. They're doing their time. There are people who are guilty who never will admit that. Remember, Ron's attorney asked him, are you sure you want to do the DNA? Because if it comes back you, that's it. And there have been people who have done that, who've said, no, I didn't do this crime. And it came back, yeah, you did. There are people like Ed, like Ron, who are wrongfully convicted in prison. And then you have people who have mental illness, who, whether they're innocent or guilty of a crime, they're not getting the help and the treatment that they need in a prison system because our prison systems lack any kind of compassion or humanity in how we treat those who are locked up. So that a lot of that to think about. Also, some prison systems do allow you to work on your GED, get a college degree. Some don't. Um, so you can, for some you can improve yourself while in prison, and in other places you can't. So it's a really hard mixture for those people who have to go from being in such a strict environment to not a strict environment. So some things to think about as we go through this. So on page 219, we see it's 4th of July. Bobby Poole is finally indicted with Mary and Jennifer's rapes. Ron ends up staying with his family. He says he's dependent on others. I was like a child, completely dependent on everyone else. After being locked up for so long, they just toss you out and expect you to deal with it. I had no money, and how could I explain on job applications where I had been for the last 11 years? One of the things that Illinois did in the last couple of years is they changed a law. So if you were a former inmate, instead of putting down on your job application that you had done time, you leave that blank. And so what happens is if you can get an interview, then at the interview stage, you explain that you were locked up for this charge. This is what you've done in the meantime. Because what they're finding is that anybody who puts down on a job application that they were a former inmate, a lot of times they don't get past an application. Nobody will hire them. And so they're trying, the whole idea of correctional facility is these people are released back into society. They've done their time. Now people are still treating them like they're some kind of monster, some kind of animal. And again, it's trying to help them and try to get our society to see that people aren't worthless and to be thrown away. And so often it's people of color who we treat that way. He says later down on the page 220, I felt the stares. So many people in the community had followed the case for years and read the headlines calling me a menace to society. Some glared at me suspiciously as if I had been just beaten a charge on some kind of technicality. There were others, though, who came up to me and shook my hand, others who had donated through churches to a fund Tom had set up for me. He says, I was so hungry for life, but at the same time it scared me. People who come out of the prison system, they're just shell-shocked. They can't get themselves motivated to move forward. They're stuck, fear just grabbing at them. They just want to depend on others. For the first few months, I was trapped in that shell, knocking on it, only cracking it, trying to come out. If I went out, I tried to have someone come with me. I was scared to go anywhere alone. I made sure I had receipts, made sure surveillance cameras at stores got good shots of me coming and going. I always wanted a witness, an alibi for every minute. And so unfortunately in our society today, even if you are not, if you're not someone who's spent time in prison, especially people of color, they have to live their lives like this. Because at any time, and I've seen videos of it where police just pull someone off the street and they assume, okay, they're black, they sort of look like this guy, so it must be this guy, and so I'm going to arrest him because he shouldn't be out or whatever. And that's not the case. It's not that person at all. And unfortunately, things like that happen. We learned that his mom is worsening. Larry King Live, the show, asked Ron if he wants to come on and talk about his case, and he does. His family gets him a suit, and then he starts learning to drive, and he's not quite good in the beginning. He's got to learn all those things again. He gets his first haircut, and his barber says, "I feel very privileged to be the first one to cut your hair since you come out." Um, and on page 223 at the top here, Ron says, "Some people thought it was strange for me to go back to the community where I had been convicted. I either got dirty looks or people acted like I was a celebrity. Either way, everyone seemed to know me." And so that's another question. It's, could you go back to the same community that convicted you, that was after you like that? That would be very hard. He did get an apology from the ADA. And as we see, Mike apologizes, the other detective Lowe apologizes to him. So he's had people apologize to him who are part of that criminal justice system. So maybe that might lessen things for a person to decide to stay there. A lot of times they stay there because that's where their support system of their family is. They can't move. On the plane ride, he gets to know Tom, and he tells Tom, I need a job. I have no money. I'm I hate feeling like I'm still a burden on my family. I want to get my life started, but I can't without any money. I don't even have a driver's license anymore. I have to take the test all over again." So Tom said he would help hook him up. And then on page 224, we find out that the governor on this show is going to give him a pardon of innocence. It means the highest official in the state of North Carolina is formally recognizing that you were innocent of all charges for which you served time. It's important for the public to know that, people who don't quite understand yet what DNA tests mean. Okay? So this show with Larry King is really to help educate people. And the ADA, Rob is on there, Rich is on there too. They explain how DNA was even better than eyewitness identification because people can make mistakes. Rob talked about the fact that there was a total absence of malice on the part of the victims, meaning that the victims weren't maliciously choosing Ron because they wanted to get him. It wasn't anything like this. That's what they originally thought. Unfortunately, there were police practices here that told Jennifer that she was correct, even though she wasn't. And there were a lot of mistakes made here by everyone. And Mike admitted to that in the last chapter. We all made a mistake here. But there wasn't really anything here that said, they were trying to really get Ron for this. I'm going to stop the video here, and then I'm going to pick up with the rest of the chapter in our second video for chapter 14.